Some nights, a map feels like a memory stirred awake by a hand you cannot see. Its paper breathing softly under lamplight, its contours trembling as if something once certain has begun dissolving. Old atlases do that, especially when you find yourself staring at the northern expanses of Eurasia, or an entire name once sprawled with quiet confidence, a name repeated across centuries of cartographers, but now exists only as a pale ghost beneath newer inks. Tartaria, a word that drifts like distant smoke. Was its disappearance accidental, or did someone somewhere decide that it no longer had the right to be remembered? Before we slip deeper into the gentle darkness of this question, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy what I'm creating here. And if your eyes are still open, share your location and local time. It always feels grounding to know where in the world you're listening from. The trouble begins when you lay several maps side by side. European maps of the 16th through 18th centuries show an enormous landmass stretching across what we now divide into Siberia, Central Asia, and the Far East. Its borders change depending on the year, the source, the political climate, yet the label remained: Tartaria. It occupied so much space that it seemed impossible for such a name to vanish without a trace. No empire so vast, no cultural zone so frequently referenced by travelers, diplomats, and chroniclers should evaporate into silence. And yet, sometime between the end of the 18th century and the middle of the 19th, it did. The letters were peeled off, dissolved, overwritten. In their place, new categories took shape: governorates, oblasts, protectorates, imperial zones, a continent of identity folded into dozens of smaller names. People often shrug and say that early mapmakers simply used the term Tartars to describe the nomadic peoples of the steppe, and that Tartaria was a vague umbrella term, a convenience rather than a reflection of a true political entity. They say the word died because the age of precision demanded its removal. But if that were the full truth, why does the erasure feel so abrupt? Why does the transition read not as a natural evolution of terminology, but as a deliberate tightening, as though someone were closing a curtain? There is an unsettling quality to historical silence, the kind that doesn't arise from lack of information, but from too much being rearranged. Empires have rewritten memory before. We have seen the Romans strike emperors from marble reliefs, the Qin dynasty burn inconvenient texts, the Church choose which gospels should and should not enter the canon. We have seen entire peoples smoothed into anonymity through colonial classifications. Knowing this, the disappearance of Tartaria begins to carry a different weight, as though someone had taken a long brush and swept across the canvas of Eurasia, reducing a once prominent name to a mere ethnographic footnote. But maybe the strangeness starts earlier, long before the erasure. When the word Tartaria appears in old writings, it's often paired with stories of cities no longer visible, of wooden fortresses swallowed by forest, of steppe cultures blending and fading, of chronicles that hint at sophisticated governance, yet leave few administrative documents behind. It is as if the region existed in a liminal state, half remembered, half mythologized. Explorers like Marco Polo described great canades and flourishing settlements, but later European chroniclers often contradict or diminish these narratives, creating a fog that thickens the further you try to walk into it. Sometimes, entire regions carry a memory of having been something else, larger, more structured, more complex, before the turbulence of history wore them down. If Tartaria was merely a convenient label, why did so many sources treat it as a coherent cultural sphere? Why did so many maps, created independently across time and nation, echo the same boundaries, the same sense of unity? And why does the sudden dismissal of the term feel less like an academic correction, and more like a resetting of historical language? There are clues that the story is not as simple as an outdated label. The 18th and 19th centuries were periods of dramatic political centralization, especially in the expanding Russian Empire. Cartographic reforms followed political consolidation, and the removal of ambiguous territorial names was encouraged. Yet political pressure alone does not explain the near-total absence of transitional terminology. No former Tartaria, no old Tartarian territories, no lingering hybrid terms. Instead, the shift is clean, almost surgical, as if the past had been edited mid-sentence. Then there's the matter of the archives. The further east you go, the more gaps appear. Fires, wars, relocations, lost collections, destroyed ethnographic records, missing census documents. Some of these losses are well documented, others attributed to causes that feel frustratingly vague. Scholars reconstruct what they can, but the scaffolding of memory has missing beams. It leaves the uncomfortable impression that even if Tartaria was not a unified civilization, something significant once existed there. Something that left impressions in architecture, folklore, trade routes, and political rivalries. Something strong enough to merit recognition, but fragile enough to vanish without leaving its own voice. And perhaps voice is the key. So much of what we know depends on who was allowed to write. What if the people of this vast region recorded their histories in media that did not survive? What if they told stories in oral traditions that faded under imperial rule? Or what if their chronicles were absorbed into the larger narratives of powers who preferred to reshape the past to fit a new order? That question lingers, unsettling and persistent. How many histories have been overwritten simply because they were inconvenient? Sometimes scholars mention that after the Napoleonic upheavals, after reforms in Russia, after the great fires of cities like Moscow, entire collections of older regional documents disappeared. Not in a dramatic blaze of conspiracy, but in quiet bureaucratic vanishings, misplaced, unreturned, unrecorded. No single event explains it, but the accumulation forms a shadow. Shadows have a habit of stretching, connecting things not meant to be connected. If a culture loses enough of its own stored memory, if its language is reframed, if its maps are redrawn, it becomes easier to fold it into someone else's narrative. And once that happens, the original outline becomes faint, like those old atlas lines that only appear under angled light. Maybe that is why Tartaria, whether empire or ethnographic region, or misunderstood collective term, feels less like a historical footnote and more like a removed chapter. And yet, the more one studies, the more a quiet unease grows. Was something deliberately obscured, or did we simply inherit a history shaped by the victors of a shifting world? Perhaps the disappearance of Tartaria from our maps is not the end of a story but the beginning of a larger question. Somewhere in that erased landscape an answer waits, silent, patient, and watching the centuries drift past like wind across the steppe. If the old maps hinted at a vanished presence, then the buildings scattered across continents whisper something even more perplexing. Structures with no signed architects, no surviving blueprints, and sometimes no confirmed date of origin. They stand like abandoned sentences in a forgotten language. Arched doorways taller than any practical need, foundations buried deeper than their reported age should allow, windows half concealed beneath layers of sediment, and facades etched with patterns that do not fully align with the styles claimed by later innovations. When you look at them long enough, a question rises slowly, as if from the stones themselves. Who built these places, and why does their authorship feel so carefully dimmed? The trouble begins with buildings that appear fully mature the first time they enter the historical record. Many European and Eurasian cities possess structures said to have been built in the 18th or 19th centuries, yet the earliest surviving photographs show them already weathered, as though they had stood long before cameras arrived. Old cathedrals with soot-darkened domes, civic halls with cracks running through their columns, train stations whose foundations appear oddly sunken, as if time had pressed down upon them before anyone claimed responsibility for their creation. Historians catalogue the official construction dates, but sometimes the visual evidence feels older than the archive narrative. Certain architectural historians mention that inconsistent building permits, missing project documents, or contradictory newspaper accounts often accompany these sites. In some cases, municipal archives record renovations but not the original construction. In others, the official narrative begins with a restoration rather than a groundbreaking ceremony, implying a building already standing, already aged, known but not described. Why would records be so thin for structures that should have represented civic pride? Grandiosity usually demands documentation. Yet in certain regions, particularly across parts of Russia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe, some archives contain little more than passing mentions, as though the buildings arrived without introduction. It is here that the contested idea of the Tartarian architecture often surfaces, not as a proven conclusion, but as an emotional reaction to the gaps. The style attributed to this lost category typically includes expansive arches, high windows, intricate reliefs, balanced symmetry, and monumental facades with an almost industrial strength. Scholars explain these features through classical revival, Baroque influences, or the spread of neoclassical education, but a lingering discomfort persists. How did so many remote cities, with limited access to advanced engineering schools in the early 19th century, produce such complex structures simultaneously? And why do some buildings in far-flung regions share unusual construction motifs, like oversized vents, giant doors, or hollow metal ornaments whose original functional purpose is not fully understood? Some researchers cite known examples of lost engineering traditions to illustrate how easily such knowledge can disappear. The construction methods behind Roman concrete were forgotten for more than 1,000 years. The techniques used to raise Egyptian obelisks remain debated. The precise architectural logic behind Inca mortalist stonework still challenges modern explanations. Knowledge vanishes when records burn, when craftsmen die without parsing their secrets, when political transitions suppress certain guilds. So the notion that an architectural lineage could shrink into obscurity is not inherently impossible, but the speed and scale with which some believe Tartaria's supposed heritage faded raises further questions. Was this merely the natural erosion of memory, or was there a decision, political, imperial, ideological, to redefine architectural authorship according to newer narratives? The theory becomes more tangled when considering the so-called mud flood claim, a controversial and widely debated idea suggesting that many old buildings were partially buried by sudden sediment, leading to the appearance of windows below street level or doors opening beneath modern ground height. Geologists counter with explanations involving sedimented river plains, shifting water tables, urban leveling, and construction practices that intentionally created half-sunken basements. Yet even within mainstream geology, there are recorded instances of cities experiencing abrupt deposition events due to storms, volcanic ash, or floodplains. The eruption of Tambora in 1815, for example, spread ash across continents. The Little Ice Age brought extreme weather fluctuations. Some European cities experienced unusual silt accumulation during river diversions. None of this confirms a catastrophe resetting civilization, but it does show how landscapes can change quickly enough to distort architectural timelines. If natural forces contributed to the partial burial of buildings, why do some urban centers exhibit multiple layers of older street levels, each seemingly forgotten by the next generation? Archaeologists accept that cities rise and fall vertically over centuries, yet the contentious point is not the layers themselves, but the absence of clear documentation around them in more recent periods. How did entire blocks obtain half-buried windows without city records mentioning the event? Why do some official renovations from the 19th century describe clearing earth from facades without explaining how that earth arrived? It is in these pockets of ambiguity that suspicion grows, not as a firm accusation, but as a question that refuses to settle. If history is usually written with pride, why do certain details appear muted, incomplete, or reactive? And who benefits when architectural origins become blurred? Political transitions may offer one explanation. The Russian Empire underwent repeated waves of reform, territorial reorganization, and cultural centralization, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. Historical narratives were streamlined to serve imperial identity, often absorbing the histories of conquered peoples into a singular storyline. Local architectural traditions were sometimes reinterpreted as evidence of imperial benevolence or development. Buildings that predated official control were sometimes retroactively credited to imperial architects. This was not unique to Russia. Similar acts occurred under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and even colonial administrations around the world. Architecture, like language, can be rewritten. Photographs complicate matters further. Early images from the mid-19th century show construction scenes that appear more like excavation than building, foundations being revealed rather than created, arches being cleared rather than assembled. Official captions describe new buildings, yet visual clues imply something else. Are these misinterpretations caused by the infancy of photography, by incomplete captions, or by the modern viewer projecting patterns onto ambiguous images? Or do they hint at a different timeline, one that never made it into the archives? The mystery deepens when one notices how often the architectural styles in question appear in cities that experience significant upheaval soon after. Fires, wars, revolutions, reconstruction campaigns. Each destruction event is well documented. What remains undocumented are the buildings that quietly disappeared in the process, erased not by conspiracy, but by urban development, modernization, or political convenience. When a city rebuilds its identity, it has little incentive to preserve the architectural signatures of an older, possibly pre-imperial past, and yet, the question lingers: why does it feel as though the true origins of these structures were not merely forgotten, but deliberately resigned to silence? Was Tartaria, a name once stretched across maps, connected to these architectural ghosts? Or is the connection itself a projection born from the discomfort of historical gaps? Whatever the answer, the stones remain patient. They do not lie, but they also do not speak. They wait for someone to ask the questions hidden in their quiet wait. There comes a moment when tracing the faint outline of a vanished past, that the silence itself begins to darken around the edges. It is then that another possibility rises, not simply that old cultures collapsed under their own weight, or that time quietly wore them down, but that someone at some point chose which memories should fade and which should remain. Empires have always held this power, gently or brutally, with the stroke of a quill or the shadow of a decree. And as the idea of Tartaria drifts between confirmed history and forgotten identity, a troubling pattern emerges. Every great empire has rewritten the world in ways we rarely recognize until centuries have passed. History shows this with an almost painful clarity. The Romans practiced damnatio memoriae, erasing the faces and names of emperors who fell out of favor. Chisels scraped across marble, documents were burned, statues were defaced until the individual seemed never to have lived at all. In ancient China, the Xin dynasty orchestrated one of the most infamous purges of written memory, destroying philosophical texts that challenged imperial ideology. What survived was often reconstructed much later, leaving scholars to guess which words were original and which were rewritten under political pressure. Even in medieval Europe, the Church controlled the flow of sacred and secular knowledge, deciding which Gospels were canonized, which chronicles were preserved, and which voices were silenced. These are not conspiracies, they are recorded historical facts, and when placed beside the disappearance of Tartaria from maps, they produce a quiet unease. If past civilizations could rewrite their own story so thoroughly, what prevents more recent powers from shaping the narrative of Eurasia according to their needs? Consider the Russian Empire, sprawling, ambitious, and under constant internal tension throughout the 17th to 19th centuries. It expanded rapidly across Siberia and Central Asia, absorbing countless tribes, khanates, and autonomous cultures. Some were allowed to keep fragments of their identity, Others were renamed, reclassified, or merged into larger administrative categories. As the empire solidified, its cartographers worked to unify its territories under a single imperial vision. Older regional names disappeared, replaced by standardized Russian designations. The purpose was not necessarily malicious. It was administrative, political, ideological. Empires do not like ambiguity. They thrive on clarity, even if the clarity is imposed. And so one wonders, was Tartaria simply too ambiguous to survive in the age of centralization? Or was it erased because it represented something larger than imperial authorities wanted acknowledged? Some historians argue that Tartary was merely a European misnomer for the steppe, a label imposed by outsiders rather than a self-claimed identity. But if that were true, why did it persist for so long across so many independent cartographers? Why did China, Persia, and segments of the Islamic world also reference similar cultural zones with overlapping terminology? And why did the name disappear so cleanly during a period marked by intense imperial consolidation? The pattern deepens when we examine how other empires rewrote cultural identities for political ends. The British Empire reclassified entire Indian communities, assigning them new caste categories that had never existed before. The French colonial administration in North Africa redrew tribal boundaries, erasing historic alliances. The Ottoman Empire recorded some ethnic groups in detail, while leaving others unnamed to avoid legitimizing their autonomy. Again and again, powerful states reshaped identity as a tool of governance. In this context, the disappearance of Tartaria takes on a different shade. It is not only the removal of a name from maps, but the disappearance of a conceptual space from collective memory. If that conceptual space once represented a collection of peoples, cultures, and territories that did not fully align with the narrative preferred by later empires, then the erasure becomes understandable, if not exactly innocent. Unity requires simplification. Complexity is a threat. There is also the matter of religious influence. Early modern Europe built much of its worldview through a Christian theological lens, framing regions beyond its grasp as other, barbaric, or pagan. Some scholars note that medieval Christian writers often used Tarta as a term of both geographic and moral distance, implying danger, chaos, or punishment. The word Tartarus, from Greek myth, an abyss, echoes faintly within it. Whether accidental or intentional, these associations helped shape how future generations perceived the lands to the north and east. A name entangled with such symbolism might eventually be deemed unsuitable for an enlightened scientific imperial age, so it was replaced with politically safer terms. But the more one studies the disappearance, the more it resembles not just political rebranding but a quiet, sweeping realignment of global history. The 18th and 19th centuries introduced scientific taxonomies, modern borders, national identities, and centralized records. This was the age when the world was reorganized into nation-states and empires framed as engines of progress. Everything that did not fit the new storylines, regional names, ambiguous cultural zones, decentralized civilizations, was smoothed out. And yet, fragments still surface. Archaeological finds in Siberia reveal fortified settlements far older than once assumed. Linguistic researchers uncover unexpected connections between steppe languages and distant cultural groups. Ethnographic archives show detailed accounts of tribes and regional powers that no longer exist in modern terminology. Even early European travel journals describe cities and traditions that seem out of place within the simplified historical narrative left behind. Perhaps the most haunting element is not that Tartaria vanished, but that it vanished cleanly. Too cleanly. Names usually fade gradually. This one disappeared almost at once, swallowed by the rising tide of imperial nomenclature. Could it be that the erasure was designed not to hide civilization, but to absorb it? Not to bury a culture, but to rename it into compliance? These questions do not accuse, They simply hover, patient and unresolved. The truth may be ordinary or extraordinary. It may reflect natural evolution or deliberate pruning. But the very existence of the gap suggests a possibility that cannot be ignored. History is shaped not only by what occurred but by who survives to tell it. Empires are storytellers with remarkable reach. They occupy not only land but memory. They decide which narratives remain, which identities crystallize, which cultures become footnotes. If an entire conceptual region could be dissolved through cartographic reform, then what else might have been lost in those same centuries of rewriting? What languages, what social systems, what technologies, what patterns of trade? The erasure of a name is rarely only a linguistic event. It is an ideological act. And somewhere in the quiet distance, the question begins to take shape. Was Tartaria misunderstood, misnamed, or systematically dismantled? Or was it something else entirely? Something that threatened established narratives? The silence does not answer. But the silence is not empty. There is a peculiar discomfort that settles in when history presents layers of earth that do not behave the way they should. Stones buried deeper than their recorded age. Windows positioned below the modern ground line. Doorways half submerged in packed sediment. It is as if certain cities woke one morning to find the earth had crept upward in the night, swallowing foundations without explanation. And when one begins to search for the cores, the answers lead not to certainty but to a haze of competing theories, some geological, some historical, and some whispered from the edges of academic acceptance. In this uneasy space, the notion of a mud-covered past emerges, not as a conclusion but as an echo carried across centuries of imperfect records. Urban stratification is a known phenomenon. Cities rise upon the remains of older versions of themselves. Streets accumulate debris, fires leave ash, floods deposit silt, and human beings build layer upon layer. Archaeologists have excavated entire ancient districts beneath modern capitals. That much is accepted, but the question becomes sharper when layers appear not across millennia, but across centuries, or even across mere decades. In certain cities, particularly those in Europe and Russia, accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries describe strange, sudden accumulations of earth after severe winters, unusual storms or unexplained flooding. Newspapers mention streets being cleared of deposits, buildings being unearthed, or foundations being freed from encroaching soil, but often without elaborating on how so much material arrived in the first place. Geologists argue that such deposits could result from heavy rainfall, glacial melt, river rechanneling, or the reshaping of terrain during rapid urbanization. These explanations are reasonable, but reasonable explanations alone do not remove the impression that something remains unaccounted for. Why do some records describe Earth reaching the second level of buildings? Why do photographs from the late 19th century show workers excavating what appear to be fully formed basements, with windows and decorative facades, as if these lower floors were intended to sit above ground? And why do so many of these anomalies cluster in regions historically associated with Tartaria on older maps? There is no need for sensationalism to acknowledge the ambiguity. Natural disasters have reshaped cities repeatedly throughout history. Tambora erupted in 1815, shrouding continents in volcanic haze. Ash fell across regions that had never before seen volcanic residue. Temperatures plummeted, crops failed. The year without a summer introduced atmospheric chaos that affected weather patterns for years. During such extreme periods, landslides, sudden floods, and unusually severe storms could have deposited surprising amounts of sediment, and yet the archival record describes the environmental consequences vividly, while remaining strangely quiet regarding the urban accumulations found in later accounts. Silence is not evidence, but it is curious. Some researchers propose that construction practices changed rapidly during the industrial era. The basements, once exposed, were gradually covered as cities installed modern sewage lines and regraded streets. There is historical support for this. Many European cities raise street levels intentionally to install sanitation systems or prevent flooding. But this explanation, while valid in many contexts, does not account for all cases. In some cities, street raising projects are well documented. In others, no such documentation exists, yet the architectural anomalies remain. It is in the gap between geologic reasoning and archival certainty that speculation begins to creep. Some voices, often dismissed too quickly, ask whether a larger environmental event might have affected multiple regions simultaneously, one not fully recorded, or one whose effects were overshadowed by political upheaval. The 17th to 19th centuries witnessed not only volcanic winters, but also the tail end of the Little Ice Age, a period marked by extreme climate anomalies. Glacial expansions, unusual precipitation cycles, freezing rivers, and rare atmospheric events were recorded across Eurasia, sometimes in language so metaphorical that modern scholars struggle to interpret it. If severe climate events reshaped landscapes across Eurasia, burying portions of cities in the process, then the question shifts from, did this happen, to why does the historical record treat its consequences with such brevity? Was it considered a mundane inconvenience? Or did later powers find it more convenient to allow these anomalies to fade into obscurity, overshadowed by imperial narratives and urban modernization? Then there is the unsettling possibility that some of the sediment layers were interpreted through political lenses rather than scientific ones. During periods of rapid territorial consolidation, empires often reconstructed cities according to standardized planning models. Renovations became opportunities to reshape urban identity. Buildings that did not fit imperial aesthetics were demolished or repurposed. Lower levels that no longer aligned with new street grids were simply filled in. This process, stretched across decades, could easily create the impression of sudden burial long after the details have been lost. But this explanation also raises another question. If the regrading was intentional, why are the records so incomplete in certain regions? Bureaucracies usually produce abundant documentation. When they do not, the absence becomes almost as interesting as the presence of information. Some scholars examining archival archives in Eastern Europe and Russia note that significant portions of urban administrative documents were destroyed in fires, wars, and relocations. The Moscow Fire of 1812 consumed libraries and regional records. Revolutions led to the destruction or dispersal of municipal archives. Wartime evacuations resulted in boxes of documents being abandoned or reassigned. In such conditions, one cannot expect perfect preservation. Yet the missing pieces still create a vacuum that invites questions. What remains most haunting is the sense of rupture, a break in continuity that feels sharper than the slow erosion of centuries. Architectural styles shift abruptly. Street levels change without full explanation. Technologies appear and disappear strangely across the timeline. Historical narratives from the era offer glimpses of disruption but rarely address its extent. It is as if something swept across parts of Eurasia, leaving enough behind to reconstruct the world, but not enough to fully understand what existed before. One need not embrace fringe interpretations to acknowledge the depth of mystery. Historical gaps are natural. Archaeology often uncovers evidence that challenges accepted timelines. Geology reveals catastrophic events that were forgotten or minimized. Written language, limited and imperfect, can only preserve so much. And yet, the convergence of buried buildings, missing records, and the disappearance of a continental cultural label invite to deeper contemplation. Perhaps the layers of earth are not simply physical but symbolic, remind us that history itself is stratified, sedimented, shaped by forces far greater than any empire or ideology. And perhaps the questions rising from these buried facades are not meant to accuse but to awaken a curiosity long quieted. If a civilization, a culture, or even a name could vanish beneath layers of earth and narrative, what else lies hidden, just out of sight, waiting for the patient eye to notice the uneven ground beneath our feet? When searching for civilization that has slipped out of the historical frame, the most fragile clues are rarely stone or metal. They are words, names whispered across borders, descriptions from travelers who saw but did not fully understand, ethnonyms that appear in one century and vanish in the next. In the shifting vocabulary of chroniclers, the peoples once associated with the vast expanse labeled Tartaria flicker in and out of existence like lanterns in a fog. Their identities blend, divide, merge, and dissolve, leaving behind a trail of linguistic ghost rather than a clear cultural lineage. And as scholars sift through these remnants, they find themselves facing not only the loss of a civilization, but the erasure of its voice. Early European maps and chronicles speak of Tartars, Tatars, Tataran, and occasionally Tartarians, terms used interchangeably, despite referring to groups with distinct languages, customs, and political structures. Some texts classify them as nomads, others describe settled cities. Still others hint at sophisticated alliances stretching across enormous distances. Yet modern narratives often compress these variations into a single label, smoothing away the complexity. When an entire region is reduced to a generalization, the people within it lose definition. And once definition fades, memory follows. But the question is not merely whether the West misunderstood these groups. It is why the misunderstanding was later allowed to harden into accepted truth without preserving the layers beneath. Linguists studying ethnonyms across Eurasia note that names like Tatara once included a wide spectrum of communities, from Turkic-speaking tribes to Mongolic groups, and even certain Finno-Ugric populations. Over time, some of these groups adopted the name willingly. Others rejected it. Others were labeled with it by outsiders. Each shift reflected not only cultural change but political influence. When empires expand, they often simplify their subjects into broad categories for easier governance. That process may seem administrative, but it carries deeper consequences. Individuality dissolves, and the inherited memory of smaller groups is overwritten by the dominant narrative. In the case of the peoples once grouped under Tartaria, many smaller identities were absorbed into imperial structures without leaving substantial self-recorded history. This is not unusual. Ethnographic erasure has occurred throughout human history. The Scythians, once feared across the ancient world, left behind stunning artifacts, but few written records. Their name, once spoken with awe, later became a vague descriptor of anyone living beyond certain borders. The Tatarians, a sophisticated people in the Tarim Basin, were forgotten for a millennium, until their mummies were rediscovered in the 20th century. Even the Hittites, whose empire once rivaled Egypt, nearly disappeared from historical memory until archaeologists unearthed their archives. These examples remind us that entire civilizations can slip into obscurity, not because they lacked culture or influence, but because later powers restructured the historical stage. With Tartaria, the difficulty deepens because the people associated with it were often nomadic or semi-nomadic. Nomadic cultures pass their traditions orally, through songs, stories, and seasonal rituals. When these traditions are interrupted by conquest, forced settlement, epidemics, or cultural assimilation, the chain of memory can break within a generation. Oral histories need continuous breath to survive. If the breath falters, the past evaporates. Yet even this cannot explain everything. For many regions once labeled Tartarian, archaeological evidence shows complex trade routes, fortified settlements, metallurgical skill, and artistic traditions that imply a more stable cultural framework than the simple label nomadic suggests. So why did the written record not keep pace? Perhaps the answer lies in the intermediaries, those who wrote not about themselves, but about others. Travelers like Plano Carpini, Rubruk, or later Russian explorers recorded what they saw, but their accounts were filtered through cultural bias, political pressure, and limited linguistic understanding. Some chroniclers romanticized the peoples of the steppe, others demonized them. Few attempted to document their internal diversity. And when empires later absorbed these regions, the earlier labels persisted as administrative tools. A name meant to describe many became a name meant to conceal the differences between them. There are also the persistent whispers within ethnographic studies that certain tribes mentioned in earlier texts simply disappear from later records, not due to annihilation but due to reclassification. A tribe becomes a subgroup becomes a locality becomes a marginal note in census documents. Each transition removes a layer of historical identity. When enough layers are removed, the original outline becomes unrecognizable. It is not only a question of missing archives, it is a question of how archives transform the living world into a manageable abstraction. Some researchers studying Siberian and Central Asian history point to abrupt shifts in terminology during the 18th and early 19th centuries. Groups once described under broader regional identities were suddenly assigned new, narrower names in imperial documents. At the same time, ethnographers working for scientific academies categorized communities according to linguistic or physiognomic criteria, rather than cultural self-definition. In doing so, they inadvertently rewrote the internal map of Eurasia. What had once been understood as a fluid network of interrelated cultures became a grid of fixed classifications. And fixed classifications often fail to capture historical truth. There is also a darker possibility that some communities were deliberately assimilated or relocated to reduce resistance to imperial expansion. Forced migrations, assimilation campaigns, and policies aimed at civilizing indigenous populations often included the suppression of local languages and traditions. When a language dies, the worldview embedded within it also dies, and with it, the memory of how people once identified themselves. This is not conspiracy. It is well documented across colonial and imperial histories worldwide. But in the case of Tartaria, the cumulative effect of these processes intersects with a name already fading from maps, creating a layered disappearance that feels simultaneously natural and orchestrated. The most haunting aspect is how often the written record contradicts itself. One chronicle describes vibrant city-states. Another insists the region was sparsely populated. One explorer recounts elaborate rituals. Another dismisses the same people as primitive. One map shows a great cultural zone. A later map replaces it with blank space. The contradictions do not point toward deception. They point toward complexity that was never fully understood, then hastily simplified. What if the people of Tartaria were not one people at all, but many, diverse, interconnected, and threaded through centuries of exchanges that left few centralized records? What if their disappearance from history reflects not a lost empire, but a lost recognition? A failure to understand their mosaic of identities before imperial systems fragmented them. If so, then the true tragedy is not the vanishing of a civilization, but the vanishing of nuance. And somewhere in that lost nuance lies a deeper question. How many cultures have slipped away not because they were insignificant, but because they did not fit the categories later imposed upon them? The silence left behind is not empty. It holds the echo of names no longer spoken, languages reduced to fragments, and stories swallowed by the turning of his empires. There are landscapes so vast that they seem to swallow time, places where the horizon stretches without interruption, and the silence feels older than history itself. In the far reaches of Siberia, across the plains of Central Asia, and through the frozen ridges of the northern steppe, remnants of something unusual lie scattered like abandoned machinery, of an age no longer remembered. Aerial surveys reveal enormous fortifications visible only from the sky. Geometric bastions, star-shaped complexes, and labyrinthine earthworks whose precision is difficult to reconcile with the sparse populations once assumed to inhabit these regions. They appear suddenly, without clear architectural lineage, as if emerging from a chapter of history that someone has quietly removed. And when researchers attempt to trace their origins, they encounter yet another silence. The most striking of these are the star forts, structures whose design is usually associated with Renaissance European military engineering. Yet the shapes found across the Russian interior and Central Asian steppe differ subtly from their Western counterparts. Some are far larger than typical fortifications. Others are positioned in remote, sparsely inhabited regions where no established city or stronghold was known to exist. Traditional military historians attribute these constructions to imperial border defenses built during specific campaigns, but the dating is often imprecise, the records incomplete, and the context uncertain. Some forts show signs of modification that do not align with the empires credited with their creation. Others appear abandoned almost immediately after construction, leaving behind no written explanation for their scale or purpose. Then there are the so-called giant industrial remains, strange pieces of machinery documented in early industrial archives, often without detailed descriptions. Enormous boilers discovered in Siberian settlements, oversized gears unearthed during canal construction, metal frameworks photographed by 19th-century surveyors, then never mentioned again. Historians interpret these artifacts as prototypes, experimental equipment, or misidentified agricultural tools, but their presence in remote regions raises quiet questions. How did such heavy equipment reach areas that, according to official records, lacked the infrastructure to transport them? Why do some of these objects appear so advanced compared to contemporary local technology? Why are the archives that mention them often fragmentary or inaccessible? It is tempting to imagine forgotten engineers shaping these regions before imperial expansion. But speculation alone is unsatisfying. Instead, the focus turns toward the broader patterns, anomalies repeating across vast distances, forming a network of architectural and technological questions. And these questions align intriguingly with the fading outline of Tartaria on older maps. If this enormous region once hosted interconnected cultures, whether advanced, modest, or simply different from what later empires described, then the remnants scattered across the landscape may represent expressions of that lost network. Consider the enormous earthworks in Siberia, some of which stretch for kilometers. Recent archaeological studies have confirmed that certain embankments and ditches are far older than previously assumed, predating imperial construction by centuries. Their scale suggests coordinated labor, their geometry implies sophisticated surveying, yet their purpose remains uncertain. Defensive structures, ritual complexes, trade hubs. The absence of definitive evidence leaves all possibilities suspended in ambiguity. What remains is a landscape marked by intention, even if the intention cannot be fully deciphered. In the Kazakh steppe, researchers have found monumental burial mounds and curiously symmetrical formations visible only through satellite imagery. Many of these structures follow precise geometric patterns, some resembling wheels, crosses, or lines stretching across open plains. Scholars debate their origins, some attributing them to Bronze Age cultures, others to later nomadic groups. But the full pattern becomes visible only through modern technology, suggesting that the people who built these structures understood the land in ways that modern historians are only beginning to detect. And then there are the northern fortresses, stone complexes discovered in remote Arctic zones, often built with techniques not fully consistent with the indigenous groups, later documented in those areas. Some exhibit advanced masonry. Others contain earth-covered chambers whose design teams optimize for thermal regulation. Yet the written record offers minimal commentary. Many of these sites were encountered during Soviet-era scientific expeditions, documented briefly, and then quietly archived. Their existence is acknowledged but rarely discussed. Some researchers propose practical explanations, early industrial experiments, forgotten military outposts, or misinterpreted natural formations. Each possibility is valid, but none fully resolves the larger pattern. The sense that these structures are fragments of something once interconnected. And when placed alongside the disappearance of Tartaria from maps, the pattern deepens. The physical remnants persist, but the narrative explaining them has thinned to the point of translucence. Certain anthropologists studying northern indigenous groups note traditions that hint at older engineering knowledge, stories of great enclosures, strange metal tools, or ancestral builders whose techniques were lost after periods of upheaval. Oral history is not a perfect record, but it often preserves shadows of earlier realities. In these shadows, one senses an unspoken memory, that the land once held more complexity than modern narratives acknowledge. Political history adds another layer. As the Russian Empire expanded eastward, it absorbed fortresses, settlements, trade routes, and local technologies. Some were documented, others were reclassified or repurposed. During imperial reforms, older sites were often attributed to newer authorities. When Soviet modernization later swept across the region, many older structures were demolished, buried, or incorporated into industrial plans. With each transformation, more pieces of the past disappeared. Not through conspiracy, but through the relentless forward motion of empire and ideology. Yet the feeling of interruption lingers. Why do so many remnants appear mature the first time they are described? Why do their origins often lack clear authorship? Why do so many of them fall within the boundaries of what was once labeled Tartaria? The silence is not absolute. It is layered, geological, political, and archival. Some of the archives that could answer these questions exist only in partial form. Others were destroyed during wars, fires, or administrative reshuffling. A few remain restricted or incompletely catalogued. The result is a tapestry with missing threads running straight across the center. What if these fragmented structures represent not a single lost civilization, but a constellation of cultures whose innovation shared certain characteristics? What if the region once held a network of builders, engineers, or craftsmen whose knowledge evolved separately from Western or Eastern traditions? If this were true, that disappearance would not require a catastrophic event, only a long period of assimilation, conflict, migration, and political redefinition. And perhaps this is the quiet tragedy beneath the question of Tartaria. Not that an empire vanished, but that a lineage of knowledge did. A lineage embedded in earthworks aligned with the horizon, in fortresses shaped like geometric stars, in machines whose purpose we no longer understand, in traditions that survived only as faint echoes in oral tales. These remnants do not proclaim their meaning. They rest in the open air, beneath snow and grass, waiting for someone willing to ask why so much intention was poured into structures whose story no longer survives. And somewhere in that stillness, a thought emerges like a distant signal. What kind of world leaves behind engineering without engineers, architecture without architects, and boundaries without names? There are moments in history when the world seems to tremble, not from the clash of armies or the rise of empires, but from forces older and far more indifferent. Long before human beings understood the atmosphere or the trembling of the earth beneath their feet, they recorded signs, strange suns, red skies, winters that refused to end, earthquakes that swallowed whole towns without mercy. And somewhere in the tangle of these observations, between the 17th and 19th centuries, lies a period of disruption so profound that it reshaped not only landscapes, but the collective memory of entire regions. When the evidence is assembled, the question becomes difficult to ignore. Did a series of natural catastrophes contribute to the disappearance of the cultural world once labeled Tartaria? Or did those catastrophes simply create the perfect fog under which someone could reframe the past? Atmospheric anomalies were recorded with unusual frequency during the centuries in question. Red sunsets across Europe that lingered for weeks, months of dimmed sunlight, reports from sailors describing strange halos encircling the moon. Chronicles from Asia speak of dust in the sky, lasting entire seasons. Many of these events have since been attributed to volcanic eruptions, Tartaria being the most infamous, but not the only one. The eruption of Lucky in Iceland in 1783 poisoned air and soil across the continent. A summer in Japan erupted a few years earlier. Smaller eruptions across the globe contributed to aerosols that altered the atmosphere. While each event now fits within the scientific understanding of volcanic climate forcing, the lived experience of these disturbances must have felt like a world losing its balance. The year without a summer, in 1816, is often treated as a historical curiosity, a cold season triggered by volcanic ash. But its consequences were far-reaching. Crops failed in North America and Europe, livestock died, rivers froze in June, famines rippled across continents, people abandoned settlements. Some historians note that these disruptions influenced migration patterns, political instability, and economic collapse. But less often discussed are the psychological effects. When the world darkens unexpectedly, societies turn inward, traditions fracture, and memory weakens. In such periods, cultures lose their foothold. Language shifts, identity blurs, archivists record less. Oral stories fade, their continuity broken by hunger and displacement. Around the same time, earthquakes struck with unusual intensity across Eurasia. The 1771 earthquake in the Altai region reshaped entire valleys. The 1802 Francia quake, one of the strongest in European history, was felt from Moscow to Istanbul. Siberian chronicles mention tremors that altered river courses. In Central Asia, several settlements were buried by landslides. When landscapes shift so violently, they do more than destroy cities. They disrupt trade routes, fragment communities, and erase local knowledge. A culture vulnerable to the pressures of empire would have struggled to maintain continuity amid such turmoil. Extreme winters intensified the disruption. The tail end of the Little Ice Age brought decades of unpredictable cold. Canals froze solid. Harvest cycles collapsed. Nomadic groups found their migration routes blocked, forcing them to alter their territories or merge with rival groups. These environmental shifts accelerated cultural assimilation. A smaller group sought survival through incorporation into larger political structures. When such assimilation occurs under duress, the result is often the loss of ancestral knowledge. Yet the most unsettling aspect of this period is not the frequency of natural disasters, but the impression that these disasters created a temporal fracture. Within the span of a few decades, older narratives dissolve, replaced by newer ones that seldom mention what came before. Scholars studying regional chronicles from Siberia, Mongolia, and Central Asia often remark that certain local histories cease abruptly during this era, replaced by imperial records written in external languages. It is as if a cultural silence settled over the region, amplified by the weight of natural catastrophe. Of course, nature alone cannot rewrite history, but it can weaken the structures that preserve it. When catastrophe and empire converge, memory becomes malleable. Industrialization added another layer of disruption. Rapid modernization across Russia and Europe required the demolition of older structures, the redirection of rivers, the expansion of railways, and the construction of factories that often swallowed ancient settlements. Urban planners leveled entire districts. Antiquarian societies prioritized classical or biblical histories, often ignoring local records that did not fit established frameworks. As modernization advanced, the remnants of earlier cultures were not always preserved. Sometimes they were not even recognized as significant. Political turmoil compounded this erasure. The Napoleonic Wars ravaged Europe. Internal reforms within the Russian Empire led to administrative reclassification of lands and peoples. The Ottoman decline reshaped trade and migration. Colonial interventions in Central Asia disrupted local governance. Revolutions ignited ideological reconstruction, during which archives were destroyed or relocated. Fires, accidental or intentional, consumed entire libraries. With each upheaval, another fragment of the past slipped beyond reach. When examining all these elements together, the volcanic winters, the earthquakes, the extreme seasons, the political upheavals, the industrial transformation, one begins to sense how a civilization or cultural zone could fragment without leaving behind a cohesive self-narrative, not through a single cataclysm, but through a series of blows that weakened its voice, until it disappeared beneath the stronger voices of rising empires. Yet the question persists: did these disruptions simply provide cover for an existing pattern of cultural absorption, or did they accelerate a process that would have occurred regardless? Empires often use crises to justify reorganization. Natural disasters create opportunity or a political consolidation. A region destabilized by famine or climate disruption becomes easier to redefine. A population scattered by environmental collapse becomes easier to classify under simplified categories. History has many examples of power stepping into the vacuum left by catastrophe. There is also the matter of how these events were recorded. European scientists of the time, focused on astronomy, physics, and geography, wrote extensively about unusual atmospheric effects. But their interest tended to lie in universal principles, not local consequences. Meanwhile, regional chroniclers struggling with famine or displacement often lack the resources to maintain detailed records. The result is an imbalance. The physical manifestations of catastrophe are well documented, but their social and cultural impacts, especially on marginal or nomadic groups, remain largely unspoken. Some modern researchers searching for evidence of Tartaria's cultural fabric find themselves looking not for monuments or cities, but for interruptions, places where historical continuity breaks, where a name or story ends abruptly, replaced by foreign classifications. These fractures often coincide with a period of extreme natural events. It is impossible to conclude causation, but the correlation is difficult to ignore. What emerges is a picture of a world shaken, reshaped, and reordered. A world where nature destabilized the ground beneath entire populations, and empire rewrote the narratives of those populations in the aftermath. Whether Tartaria was a unified civilization, or a mosaic of cultures, the forces that swept across Eurasia during these centuries would have dismantled its continuity, leaving behind only fragments scattered across maps, oral traditions, and mysterious architectural remnants. And somewhere in the quiet between those fragments lies a question that refuses to fade. If catastrophe can erase the memory of a people, how much of what we call history is merely what survived the last shaking of the earth? It is strange how the grandest buildings can feel the most fragile once their stories begin to unravel. Nowhere is this more true than in the spectacle of the great world expositions, vast celebrations of progress that appeared across Europe and America in the 19th and early 20th centuries. They were announced as triumphs of modern engineering, shrines to industrial mastery, dazzling displays of what humanity could build. And yet, when one looks closely at the photographs, studies the timelines, or reads the reports written by curious visitors, another impression quietly emerges: that some of the structures displayed at these fairs appeared too complete, too mature, too monumental to have been assembled within the short deadlines claimed. They stand in the images not as new creations, but as things rediscovered, repurposed, or presented under a different name. It is, of course, well documented that many exposition buildings were temporary, constructed from plaster, wood, and metal frames designed to mimic the appearance of stone. Architects of the era mastered the art of illusion, but there remain cases where the illusion seems almost too perfect. Buildings said to have been erected in a few months show weathering inconsistent with newly built facades. Massive domes appear assembled without the required scaffolding documented. Intricate stonework, if it were truly plaster, seems improbably detailed, especially given the rapid pace of exposition schedules. Photographs show workers standing beside structures whose scale dwarfs them, yet the official records describing their construction are oddly brief, incomplete, or absent altogether. Perhaps the most unsettling detail is the visual contradiction. New buildings that already look ancient, as though the architects were unveiling rather than building them. In certain images, the foundations appear worn. The surfaces show faint irregularities that occur naturally in older stone. Some columns seem to sag slightly, as if they were not designed for a temporary display. Even the atmospheric soot staining visible in some photos raises questions. Why would a brand new exposition structure exhibit such patina? Historians explain these inconsistencies through photographic artifacts, lighting effects, or restoration of older structures included within exhibition grounds. These explanations hold truth, and yet doubt persists precisely because the documentation is not as complete as one would expect for events meant to showcase national pride. It is as though the fairs were spectacles built not only to impress but to obscure, reframing old structures within a narrative of modernity. In the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, for example, the so-called White City rose with breathtaking speed, its gleaming facades heralded as the dawn of a new architectural era. Millions visited. But the city was burned and demolished within a short span of time, leaving behind almost no physical evidence of its existence. What remains are photographs, images that show vast neoclassical complexes with proportions that some engineers today still find inexplicably ambitious for supposedly temporary buildings. The official narrative states that these were plaster constructions, yet reports from visitors describe surfaces that felt like stone. Some noted the building seemed too established, as if they were uncovering something rather than witnessing creation. In Paris, the Exposition Universelle of 1889 showcased monumental structures alongside the Eiffel Tower. Many of the temporary buildings were indeed constructed for the event, but others appear in earlier maps and sketches under different names. Some historians speculate that all the palatial buildings were absorbed into exposition grounds and rebranded as modern achievements. Others simply accept that the photographic record is incomplete. The problem is not the presence of new construction, but the absence of clear timelines showing how certain structures came to be. When history leaves gaps, imagination fills them, and what makes these gaps even more intriguing is their geographical spread. Expositions in St. Louis, San Francisco, Vienna, and Moscow all reveal similar patterns: monumental structures with ephemeral documentation, temporary buildings with permanent appearance, and cultural pavilions whose stylistic origins predate the events that supposedly inspired them. In each location, the exposition functioned as both a celebration and a reset, a stage upon which new narratives were performed, while older ones quietly disappeared beneath the applause. It is here that the shadow of Tartaria re-enters the frame, not as a proven reality, but as a question. If a vast cultural zone once existed across Eurasia, possessing architectural traditions distinct from later imperial styles, could some of its remnants have survived into the modern era, only to be repurposed, reframed, or quietly removed? If all the buildings were incorporated into exposition grounds, perhaps because they were aesthetically impressive but politically inconvenient, then the fairs themselves may have served as a mechanism of erasure. A structure without a clear origin becomes a blank slate onto which a new story can be projected. This possibility gains weight when one considers the social atmosphere surrounding the expositions. They were moments when nations competed to demonstrate progress, sophistication, and dominance. In such an environment, older structures of unclear origin could be explained away as modern achievements. Temporary facades could be used to conceal the reuse of older foundations. A building that did not fit the official narrative could be showcased once and then demolished, removing inconvenient evidence. Official reports from some expositions speak of reconstruction rather than construction, recladding rather than building from scratch. These words hint at an underlying architectural inheritance. But inheritance from whom? And why is that question so rarely asked? One must also consider the psychological impact of the expositions. Millions saw these buildings. Millions were taught to associate them with modernity. In doing so, a collective assumption was created that such architecture belonged to the present, not the past. Visitors marveled at innovation while unknowingly internalizing a rewritten timeline of human achievement. If older structures were hidden in plain sight, their origins were effectively overwritten by applause. But perhaps the most haunting detail comes not from the buildings themselves, but from their disappearance. After the fairs, many structures were immediately destroyed, burned, dismantled, or buried. Official records cite cost, maintenance, or lack of long-term utility. But the speed of their removal feels almost theatrical, as though the performance had ended and the stage needed to be cleared before questions could be asked. A building that no longer exists cannot be studied. A structure removed from the landscape is removed from the timeline, and with it, any trace of an earlier world fades. This does not prove that exposition buildings were repurposed relics of a forgotten civilization, but it highlights a pattern. Monumental structures appearing suddenly, celebrated briefly, then erased decisively. A cycle of unveiling and disappearance, a rhythm of revelation and concealment, a choreography that feels almost too precise to be coincidence. And so the question lingers, soft yet persistent. Were the World Exposition's displays of progress, or veils drawn over older architectural memories, allowing history to be rewritten not through force, but through spectacle? The silence of those demolished buildings suggests that whatever answers existed once stood in plain sight, only to vanish before anyone realized what they were seeing. Maps have always given the illusion of certainty. Lines, colors, and labels arranged with confidence, as if the world could be flattened into clarity and pinned beneath glass. Yet the deeper one studies cartography, the more evident it becomes that maps are not mirrors, they're arguments. They reflect not only geography but ideology, ambition, fear, and the shifting power of those who commission them. When a name vanishes from a map, it is never a simple correction. It is a change of worldview. And nowhere does this feel more unsettling than in the case of Tartaria, whose once sprawling presence on charts across Europe and Asia faded with an abruptness that suggests not natural evolution, but a deliberate redrawing of understanding. Early maps from the 1500s to the 1700s show Tartaria as an enormous cultural and geographic zone, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. The boundaries vary, the subregions shift, but the name persists with remarkable consistency. This steadiness across centuries and nations suggests that the term meant something, a recognized identity, even if externally defined. Chinese maps reference vast northern realms with similar contours. Islamic cartographers note regions described in overlapping terms. European atlases produced in cities separated by ideology, language, and politics still agree on the basic outline. Such widespread concurrence does not arise from coincidence, and yet sometime in the 19th century the name dissolves, not gradually but decisively. In its place appear the newer administrative borders of expanding empires, governorates, districts, oblasts, protectorates. The transformation is so complete that it becomes difficult to imagine the earlier cartographic worldview. What was once a single, sweeping cultural concept becomes fragmented into dozens of smaller identities. The unity implied by earlier maps is replaced by a mosaic constructed to fit the political needs of the time. Scholars often argue that older mapmakers simply used imprecise terminology, grouping diverse peoples under umbrella names. And it is true that early maps contain errors and approximations. But imprecision alone cannot account for the systematic disappearance of a major geographic label across all major cartographic traditions. If Tartaria was simply an antiquated term, why did its removal happen concurrently with territorial consolidation by powerful empires? Why did the name survive for centuries only to vanish during the very period when map-making became more standardized and scientific? The question becomes sharper when examining specific cartographic revisions. Russian imperial maps produced in the early 18th century still reference vast Tartarian zones. But by the mid-19th century, new maps commissioned by the empire eliminate the term entirely, replacing it with imperial subdivisions. The shift is not just semantic, it represents an ideological claim. A territory that once appeared culturally distinct is now integrated into a centralized vision of the state. Boundaries are redrawn not to reflect reality but to shape it. European mapmakers followed suit. British, French, and German atlases removed the name, aligning their publications with the geopolitical expectations of the time. Some historians suggest that as Europe began to adopt scientific geography, older labels were discarded in favor of ethnographic and political specificity. But specificity does not usually require erasure. It requires refinement. And yet refinement is not what occurred here. The disappearance of Tartaria feels less like clarification and more like a mission. Even more intriguing is the disappearance of certain cities from maps, settlements once drawn confidently, later replaced by blank space or absorbed into newly imposed administrative labels. Some towns reappear decades later under different names. Others vanish entirely. In certain cases, the only trace of a lost settlement is a faint symbol on an antique chart, accompanied by a description too vague to interpret. Scholars attribute these absences to inaccuracies, incomplete surveys, or cartographic speculation. Those explanations hold weight. But when patterns of disappearance align with shifting political borders, coincidence begins to feel insufficient. The pattern extends beyond Russia. Central Asian maps produced by Persian, Mughal, and Ottoman cartographers also underwent revisions during this era. Older names aligned with steppe cultures gradually gave way to imperial nomenclature. In many cases, the earlier labels were not incorrect. They simply did not serve the political needs of newer rulers. If cartography is a form of authority, then renaming is an assertion of control. Compounding the mystery is the fate of certain historical maps themselves. Collections once held in monasteries, universities, or royal archives were destroyed by war, fire, or neglect. Others were reorganized, reclassified, or lost during political transitions. The Moscow Fire of 1812 consumed countless documents. European library fires erased centuries of cartographic material. Ottoman archives were disrupted during successive wars. Each loss may have been accidental, yet the cumulative effect creates vast gaps that obscure earlier geographic understanding. What remains are fragments, maps with missing corners, atlases missing pages, charts surviving only as secondary reproductions. And within these fragments linger faint outlines of a world that no longer fits within modern borders, a world whose naming conventions hint at cultural continuities now forgotten. We cannot reconstruct that world with precision, but we can recognize that its erasure was not passive. Even modern scholars studying cartographic history acknowledge that maps are tools of power. They're used to claim land, define identity, and solidify narratives. When empires rise, maps change. When ideologies shift, borders are reimagined. When cultural memory becomes inconvenient, names disappear. But beneath this political layer lies something more philosophical, a recognition that maps create the illusion of permanence, when in fact they are snapshots of belief. A map is not a photograph. It is a worldview, and when worldviews shift, so does the map. The disappearance of Tartaria, then, may not point to a vanished empire in the literal sense, but it does point to a vanished worldview, one in which the vastness of Eurasia was understood differently, with cultural borders that did not fit the later frameworks of nation-states and centralized empires. What was once a coherent concept became inconvenient, and inconvenient concepts rarely survive the rewriting of history. Yet the haunting question remains, if the cartographers of earlier centuries all saw something there, something large, something unified, something worthy of a name, what exactly did they see? Was it a civilization, a cultural constellation, a network of societies with shared traits? Or was it simply a conceptual space that modernity found too messy to keep? The maps no longer answer. Their silence is absolute. But silence too contains meaning. It marks the place where something once was, something that shaped the way the world was drawn and then vanished from the page without a trace. And perhaps that absence, more than any remaining line or label, holds the deepest truth about how history is constructed. There are moments in the study of history when a question rises so gently that at first you almost ignore it. Technology, we assume, moves in a steady line. Discovery, refinement, improvement, replacement. But sometimes that line bends strangely, and the inventions that appear on the timeline seem older than their patents, more mature than their surrounding context, or too widespread to have emerged independently in isolated cities. These anomalies rarely fit the polished narrative of progress. Instead, they hang like loose threads, suggesting not invention but rediscovery, as though the world occasionally stumbles upon knowledge that once existed elsewhere, under a name now erased. In the early 19th century, for instance, electrification appeared with a swiftness that continues to puzzle historians. The voltaic pile was introduced in 1800. Within decades, entire cities had electric lighting demonstrations, telegraph lines stretched across continents, arc lamps illuminated public squares, yet the machinery depicted in some early industrial illustrations appears remarkably sophisticated. Coiled wires, capacitors, transformers, dynamos, devices that seem to leap several steps beyond the crude prototypes one might expect from such an early technological phase. Historians explain this acceleration through the convergence of scientific communities, but even they admit the rapidity is unusual. It is as though the concept of electricity arrived fully formed, waiting only to be reassembled. Patent archives add to the unease. Some early designs, filed in the 1800s, describe mechanisms with surprising nuance. Pressurized air systems capable of powering transit, pneumatic tubes proposed for citywide travel, intricate water purification devices whose design resembles modern technologies more closely than their contemporaries. Many of these prototypes were never built, their creators dismissed as eccentric. Yet their designs show a level of understanding that raises quiet questions about where their ideas originated. Were they visionaries, or were they reaching for concepts already whispered in the intellectual undercurrents of the time? Then there are the photographs, grainy, sepia-colored windows into the dawn of the industrial age. In them appear machines so large and complex that they seem out of step with the narrative of recent invention. Engines with oversized pistons, turbines that resemble modern hydropower equipment, generators that, while primitive in appearance, display structural features that suggest an inheritance rather than a beginning. Some engineers studying these images remark on peculiar details, metal castings too refined for their supposed era, tolerances that seem too tight for early machining, or architectural surroundings that hint at prior industrial infrastructure. One might dismiss these as misinterpretations. Photographs often distort scale, and early engineers were indeed capable of impressive feats. But when these anomalies cluster in regions historically associated with the fading outline of Tartaria, the question deepens. If a cultural zone with advanced engineering traditions once existed, even if not unified into an empire, could some of its technologies have persisted quietly into the early modern period, carried by craftsmen, guilds, or scattered workshops? And if so, could the industrial age have been less a beginning and more a resurfacing? The idea gains subtle support from accounts written by travelers who described unusual machines in remote Eurasian regions during the 17th and 18th centuries. Some mention waterworks of peculiar efficiency. Others describe heating systems embedded beneath city streets, details reminiscent of Roman hippocausts, yet located far beyond Roman influence. There are accounts of metallurgical techniques capable of producing steel of exceptional purity, long before Western methods achieved the same consistency. Mainstream historians acknowledge these accounts, though they often reinterpret them through the lens of exaggeration or misunderstanding. But even if the travelers embellish their stories, physical evidence still remains. Fragments of machines discovered during excavations, unusual alloys found in old industrial ruins, and infrastructural remnants whose scale seems disproportionate to the settlements around them. Some of these finds have perfectly reasonable explanations. Others rest uneasily on the border between anomaly and oversight. Another layer of mystery emerges in the sudden appearance of pneumatic transit proposals during the 19th century. Engineers in London, New York, and Russia independently proposed or constructed early pneumatic railways using pressurized air to propel carriages. The concept seems startlingly modern, yet all these attempts occurred within a short time span, followed by an equally sudden disappearance of interest. Some historians attribute the decline to inefficiency or high costs. But it is curious how rapidly enthusiasm evaporated, as if the experiments touched upon something not yet ready to be integrated into the broader narrative of progress. Similarly, some early electrical demonstrations featured devices whose exact internal workings were not fully documented. Public exhibitions showed lights, motors, or magnetic apparatuses that drew crowds, only for the inventors to fade into obscurity afterward. In some cases, their notes disappeared. In others, the devices were dismantled, lost, or destroyed. This pattern, the unveiling of a remarkable idea followed by an abrupt cessation, feels less like failure and more like interruption. A different kind of puzzle emerges in architecture. Many structures built during the early industrial period contain design elements that seem optimized for electrical or mechanical systems before such systems were widely available. Conduits embedded in walls, openings suitable for wires or tubes, foundations strong enough to support heavy equipment, ventilation shafts whose purpose does not fully align with recorded use. These details may reflect architectural experimentation, but they may also hint at earlier knowledge absorbed into new forms. In the broader picture, what becomes clear is not that a forgotten civilization had advanced technology, but that the timeline of technological emergence is less linear than textbooks suggest. Cultures rise and fall, knowledge is lost and regained. Techniques evolve, disappear, and reappear centuries later. The collapse of Rome erased engineering knowledge later rediscovered in the Renaissance. The loss of Greek fire remains unexplained. The method for producing Damascus steel vanished for centuries. History contains many such ruptures. If Tartaria was not an empire but a cultural constellation, perhaps it developed technologies that were later forgotten, absorbed, or misunderstood. Its scattered people might have carried fragments of knowledge across continents, parsing them into guilds, workshops, or oral traditions. When the industrial age arrived, these fragments could have resurfaced as inventions that seemed ahead of their time, not because they were new, but because they were echoes. This perspective does not require myths, only an acknowledgement that human knowledge is fragile, that what we call invention might sometimes be memory resurfacing, that history contains folds in which earlier worlds hide. If so, the technologies that appear abruptly in the 19th century might indeed belong to a network of ideas that extends deeper into time than we realize, threading through vanished cultures, forgotten craftsmen, and maps altered by empire. And somewhere in that thread, faint but persistent, lies the possibility that Tartaria's presence did not vanish abruptly. It simply seeped into the machinery of a new world, leaving its signature in devices whose origins now appear mysterious only because the story that once explained them has been lost. Archives are often imagined as sanctuaries, quiet, dust-filled chambers where the past rests undisturbed, waiting for careful hands to lift it back into the light. But anyone who has ever stepped into an old repository knows the truth is far less romantic. Archives breathe. They shift. They're vulnerable to neglect, fire, theft, decay, political upheaval, and the slow forgetfulness of institutions overwhelmed by their own contradictions. And somewhere in that vulnerability lies a question that becomes more haunting. The deeper one follows the fading echo of Tartaria. What if the reason we cannot fully reconstruct its story is not because it never existed, but because the voices that could have described it were quietly extinguished by time, by circumstance, or by intention? Consider the number of archives that vanished during the centuries when Tartaria disappeared from maps. The Moscow fire of 1812 destroyed thousands of manuscripts, administrative records, and regional accounts, documents that covered precisely the periods when the Russian Empire absorbed and reclassified vast territories. Entire collections were lost in a matter of hours. Historians often describe the fire as a pivotal cultural catastrophe, yet rarely explore its implications for understanding the interior zones of Eurasia. How many village histories, trade registries, land surveys, and linguistic notes were consumed? How many chronicles written by local scribes vanished without even the dignity of an inventory list? Then came the wars of the 19th century, each reshaping borders and administrative centers, resulting in the relocation or destruction of archives. Some were taken as trophies, some were hidden and forgotten, others were burned to prevent enemies from accessing sensitive information. In the chaos of war, records become fragile, lost not only to flames but to disorganization. Boxes mislabeled, documents stored in damp basements, parchments eaten by mold before anyone realized their importance. And as the 20th century arrived, the vulnerability only deepened. Revolutions swept across Russia and Central Asia, uprooting entire bureaucracies. Offices were abandoned, ransacked, repurposed. Archives deemed politically inconvenient were purged. Collections once maintained by religious institutions were seized or scattered. Older materials were sometimes classified, sometimes destroyed, sometimes simply left to decay because no one had the resources to preserve them. This was not a coordinated erasure, at least not always. It was the natural consequence of upheaval in empires struggling to define themselves. Yet the effect is eerily similar to deliberate censorship, a silence that feels too complete, too uniform. It becomes even more perplexing when one considers how many archives burned not once but repeatedly. Fires consumed the Library of Congress in the United States in the early 19th century. European archives suffered during the Napoleonic Wars. In the Ottoman Empire, successive conflicts resulted in the loss of regional records. Even peaceful cities occasionally experienced catastrophic library fires, whose causes historians still debate. It is tempting to view these as isolated tragedies. But when placed side by side, a pattern emerges. The centuries of greatest political and technological transformation correspond almost perfectly with the centuries in which entire swathes of written memory were lost. What remains are fragments, letters written by travelers, incomplete census lists, maps with missing labels, ethnographic notes that allude to cultures no longer documented. Some researchers describe the feeling of studying these scattered relics as standing in the ruins of a building whose foundation is intact, but whose walls have collapsed. You can see where rooms once were, where corridors once led, but the structure itself has vanished into absence. And in that absence, the silence of Tartaria grows louder. When historians attempt to reconstruct the peoples of Siberia, Central Asia, and the Far East during the periods in question, they encounter not only missing documents but inconsistencies within the surviving ones. A region described in one century as having active trade networks appears in the next as sparsely populated. A culture noted for its fortified settlements suddenly disappears from chronicles without any mention of collapse or migration. Names shift, languages are reassigned. Small tribes become administrative abstractions. Large confederations become footnotes. It is not that the records contradict each other, they evaporate. Even more troubling is the problem of rewritten archives. After revolutions or regime changes, new authorities often edited older documents to align with current ideology. Dates were adjusted, ethnic categories were redefined, place names were standardized, some records were deemed irrelevant and thrown away. Others were rewritten so subtly that the original meaning became impossible to decipher. The concept of historical continuity, so often taken for granted, becomes fragile under such conditions. For researchers, the hardest part is not the missing documents. It is the documents that exist only because they survived by chance. A traveler's journal overlooked in a private attic. A monastery's index of texts destroyed centuries ago. A regional map tucked between the pages of an unrelated archive. Each survivor offers a glimpse, but never the whole. It is as if the past is glimpsed through cracks in a ruined wall, leaving you to imagine the missing sections without ever seeing them. And yet, amid this uncertainty, some details persist with stubborn resilience. Mentions of cities no longer on maps, descriptions of customs unaligned with modern ethnographic classifications, references to alliances, confederations, and regional powers that appear abruptly in one chronicle and vanish in the next. These fragments feel like the shadows of a cultural world too complex to be summarized by the labels imposed upon it later. Some scholars argue that the disappearance of Tartaria from archives simply reflects the evolution of ethnography and political administration. But that explanation only answers part of the puzzle. It does not explain the missing documents. It does not explain the abrupt silences. It does not explain why so many records relevant to the region's cultural identity were housed in the very archives most vulnerable to destruction. It also does not explain the peculiar fate of certain restricted collections, archives that through accident or design became inaccessible for decades. Some Soviet-era repositories containing pre-revolutionary documents remained classified until the late 20th century. Others were catalogued poorly, leaving researchers unaware of their contents. In some cases, documents referenced in older secondary sources are no longer traceable. One does not need to invoke conspiracy to recognize that the survival of history often depends less on truth than on the caprices of administrators, the priorities of governments, and the accidents of storage. What emerges from this tangle is neither a dramatic cover-up nor a straightforward explanation. Instead, it is a realization that history is fragile, and the archives that preserve it are even more so. Entire cultures have vanished from the written record not because they lacked significance, but because their documents did not survive the fires, wars, reorganizations, and ideological storms that engulfed their custodians. If Tartaria existed not as a unified empire, but as a vast cultural constellation, then perhaps its disappearance was not a single event but a slow erasure, an erosion of documents, a scattering of oral traditions, a reclassification of peoples, a renaming of lands, and somewhere in that erosion lies a deeper question. How many worlds have slipped between the shelves of archives, lost not through malice, but through the quiet indifference of time? The silence of the archives does not answer, but it makes you aware of something larger, that the past is not what survived. It is what survived by accident. When a civilization leaves behind monuments, scripts, dynasties, and chronicles, its existence becomes difficult to erase. But when a people live in motion, migrating with seasons, blending through intermarriage, dividing and reuniting across centuries, their memory becomes as vulnerable as breath in a winter wind. They may be vast in number, influential in trade, inventive in craft. But if their stories are not written in the kind of ink that archives guard, they risk dissolving into the background of history. And somewhere within that dissolution lies a question that has gained weight with each passing part of this long search. If Tartaria was not an empire, but a constellation of peoples, then which of those peoples slipped through the cracks so completely that we can no longer hear their voices? Human identity is often defined by the stories a culture tells about itself. But in regions where oral tradition dominated, where history was sung rather than written, a single interruption, a famine, a political shift, a forced relocation could silence centuries of accumulated memory. Anthropologists studying indigenous Siberian groups have noted that some clans remember ancestral names for only a few generations, then the record fades. Elders carry the lineage, but when elders die suddenly, as often happened during epidemics, wars, or periods of starvation, the chain breaks. What follows is not extinction, but quiet absorption. A people become part of a larger group. Their identity merges into a broader category, and their individual stories scatter like dust. Throughout Eurasia, especially across the lands once marked as Tartaria, there are traces of communities described briefly in old chronicles, then never mentioned again. A tribe listed as occupying a river valley in one century is absent from the next. A linguistic group referenced by early explorers disappears without documented migration. Some reappear under different names, assimilated into newly dominant cultures. Others vanish entirely, leaving only ambiguous descriptions: forest people, steppe riders, mountain dwellers, tent builders, iron workers. Labels too broad to preserve identity, too vague to survive the scrutiny of later ethnographers. The Russian Empire's expansion brought administrative order, but also linguistic simplification. Local names were replaced with Russian exonyms. Tribal distinctions were collapsed into standardized categories. Some groups were recorded only during census efforts, then immediately reclassified in the next. This was not unusual. Empires everywhere have done this. But the effect is that many peoples known to early travelers now appear in history only as footnotes or misidentifications. Even today, anthropologists still debate the origins of certain Siberian groups, whose DNA, language families, and material culture do not fully align with their modern classifications. These debates reveal a deeper truth. The past was far more complex than the borders and categories we inherited. Travelers' journals from the 17th and 18th centuries contain clues that often feel like fragments of lost identities. There are mentions of powerful confederations of nomadic tribes whose political structures vanished without direct successes. Some accounts describe fortified towns inhabited by mixed communities: Turkic, Mongolic, Uralic, sometimes even Iranian-speaking groups. These settlements were later abandoned, destroyed, or repurposed, leaving no clear lineage to modern populations. European chroniclers wrote of tribes who practiced advanced metallurgy, crafted intricate textiles, or engaged in long-distance trade routes that do not appear in later records. These glimpses suggest cultural richness, yet the absence of internal documentation leaves everything open to interpretation. In many cases, the disappearance of these groups coincides with periods of extreme hardship. Epidemics introduced by expanding empires decimated populations. Harsh winters during the Little Ice Age forced migrations that disrupted traditional lifeways. Droughts altered grazing routes. Floods destroyed settlements. Political conquests reshaped alliances. Under such pressure, smaller groups often joined larger ones for survival, losing their distinct identities in the process. Their words, rituals, and stories were absorbed into broader cultural frameworks, leaving archaeology to speak in their stead. But archaeology, silent and incomplete, can only hint at what once existed. Even linguistic studies, one of the primary ways scholars reconstruct the past, reveal deep discontinuities. The Turkic, Mongolic, Tungusic, Uralic, and Yeniseian language families all intersect across regions once labeled Tartarian. Some share loan words that suggest centuries of interaction. Others contain isolated terms whose origins remain unidentified. Linguists occasionally stumble upon a root word that appears in no surviving language, yet surfaces in place names scattered across thousands of kilometers. Such words may be all that remains of extinct dialects spoken by peoples whose identities were swallowed by time. One of the most intriguing examples involves the Ket people of Siberia, a tiny group whose language has no close relatives among surrounding populations. Some researchers connect it to the ancient Yeniseian family, potentially linked to cultures that once spread widely across the region. If so, The ket may represent the last surviving thread of a vast linguistic tapestry now lost. Their isolation suggests that countless other groups, once widespread, have disappeared without leaving descendants who retained their names or languages. Ethnographers of the 19th century famously lamented the difficulty of classifying the peoples they encountered. They described communities that defied neat categorization, groups who blended various cultural elements, spoke multiple languages, or shifted identities depending on alliances or seasons. Such fluidity made them resistant to the rigid classifications imposed by modern states. And as those states solidified, populations with fluid identities were forced into fixed categories, often losing their historical nuance. In this way, diverse cultures were compressed into administrative labels that erased centuries of distinct existence. Some of the most haunting evidence comes not from texts, but from the artifacts left behind. Ornaments crafted in styles not seen among neighboring groups, burial mounds whose orientation differs from later customs, tools forged with techniques no longer practiced, symbols etched onto wood or bone that do not fit known writing systems. These objects speak, but only faintly. They tell us that people lived, created, and believed, but not who they were. Archaeologists can reconstruct their daily lives, but not the stories they told about themselves. And perhaps that is the deepest loss, the stories. Without them, a people becomes a category, a statistic, a material culture described in passive voice. What once breathed becomes merely observed. If Tartaria was not a single people, but a vast network of interconnected cultures, then its disappearance may reflect not a collapse, but a diffusion. Its identity diluted across borders, languages, and empires until the original contours became impossible to trace. A mosaic broken not by a single blow, but by countless subtle pressures, economic, environmental, political, generational. And somewhere in that dissolution lies a quiet ache. How many human worlds have been lost not because they lacked importance, but because they lacked archivists? The silence surrounding these forgotten peoples is not empty. It holds the weight of lives lived beneath skies now mapped under different names, lives that shaped the land, traded across broad frontiers, built settlements now vanished, spoke languages no one will ever hear again, a continent's worth of voices reduced to hints. And the question lingering in the dimness is simple, yet immense. If these people shaped the cultural landscape that early mapmakers called Tartaria, then what else has vanished with them? What wisdom, what kinship patterns, what technologies, what beliefs? The past does not answer. It only leaves traces, waiting for someone patient enough to imagine the lives behind them. Sometimes, when you study the rise of the modern world, you feel an abrupt acceleration, an almost unnatural quickening, as if history suddenly lurched forward after centuries of drifting. The industrial age is often described as a triumph, a flowering of human ingenuity, a sudden unlocking of mechanical imagination. But when you examine its earliest decades closely, the smooth narrative begins to fray. Too many inventions appear at once. Too many technologies emerge fully formed. Too many photographs show machines that look older than the factories that supposedly birthed them. And in that strangeness, a disturbing thought unfolds quietly. What if the industrial boom was not a beginning, but a resumption? What if something already existed, something half remembered, partially buried, or absorbed into the ambitions of new empires? In the 18th and 19th centuries, steam engines, turbines, electrical devices, precision tools, and advanced metallurgical methods seemed to erupt across Europe and Russia almost simultaneously. Official histories attribute this to the Enlightenment, to scientific collaboration, to the spread of literacy and experimentation. And much of that is true. But some historians privately admit that certain leaps appear disproportionate to the available foundations. A society does not typically move from horse-drawn carts to complex rail systems in a mere handful of decades. And yet, it happened. Telecommunication systems arose in nations that, only a generation earlier, lacked widespread mechanical infrastructure. Iron bridges spanning entire rivers appeared almost overnight, built by engineers whose formal training would now be considered rudimentary. Even the earliest factories seem oddly mature. Their layouts hint at optimization patterns more advanced than the broader economic environment of their time. Ventilation systems appear smarter than the architectural norms of the era. Some facilities contain substructures beneath their foundations, tunnels, chambers, conduits, that lack clear documentation. Although these features often have reasonable explanations, the absence of detailed records invites a quiet unease. Scholars familiar with these anomalies rarely draw attention to them, focusing instead on reconstructing industrial genealogy from fragments that sometimes feel incomplete. And then there are the machines, sturdy, intricate, symmetrical, captured in sepia-toned photographs that reveal engraved parts, castings of unusual complexity, and designs that seem refined rather than experimental. You would expect clumsy prototypes. Instead, you see devices that look like the mature descendants of long evolutionary lines. Some of these machines appear in workshops surrounded by workers who seem unfamiliar with them, as though the apparatus had been brought in from elsewhere. In a few rare images, the machines seem older than the buildings containing them. Their edges carry dings and wear inconsistent with being newly manufactured. Metal weathers slowly, and yet some early engines appear already roughened by time. These peculiarities might seem coincidental, until you notice how many of them occur across regions once labeled Tartaria on earlier maps. Factories in the Urals, workshops in Siberia, early industrial complexes in Central Asia, rail lines in remote northern districts, all show signs of maturity that exceed their expected developmental stage. Imperial historians explain this discrepancy by citing rapid modernization efforts, imported expertise, or exceptional local craftsmen. But these explanations often fall short. How could remote settlements, with minimal recorded training, produce intricate metal work so quickly? How did certain regions leap from small-scale artisanal production to heavy machinery within a decade? A handful of scholars propose a subtle possibility that these regions possessed local technological traditions predating imperial absorption. Not advanced in a fantastical sense, but materially sophisticated. Knowledge of metallurgy, heating systems, hydraulics, and mechanical leverage. If those traditions were not written down, if they lived only in workshops and guilds, they could vanish rapidly once empires reorganized labor and centralized education. What remains would be artifacts whose lineage appears mysterious, not because they came from another world, but because the thread connecting them to their creators was severed. Such severance can happen quickly. When regimes shift, older practices are often forbidden, replaced, or derided as primitive. Skilled craftsmen are relocated, conscripted, or absorbed into imperial factories. Their techniques become state property. Their history becomes irrelevant, and their identity dissolves. This is not speculation. It is a pattern repeated in countless regions throughout history. When political power reshapes knowledge, the origin of that knowledge becomes secondary to its utility. The industrial age intensified this process. Nations vied for prestige through scientific prowess. Patents became instruments of national pride. Methods with obscure origins were rebranded under the names of modern inventors. Experiments that did not fit the desired narrative were quietly omitted from textbooks. Whenever an innovation emerged, the question of where the idea came from mattered far less than who controlled it next. In such an environment, older technologies, especially those transmitted through oral craft traditions, could be absorbed silently, without acknowledgement. There is also the troubling pattern of sudden technological dead ends. Throughout the 19th century, certain machines appeared briefly, functioned impressively, then vanished. Early electric streetcars that ran on principles later rediscovered decades afterward. Steam engines of unusual efficiency that were documented once and never again. Heating systems embedded beneath city streets, later removed or forgotten. Some of these devices appear too complex to have been one-off experiments, yet no records explain their disappearance. It is as if the knowledge behind them evaporated, leaving only the physical reminders for future generations to puzzle over. Photographs taken during the rapid industrialization of Russia add another layer to the mystery. In some images, massive iron structures sit incongruously in landscapes that lack the infrastructure necessary to produce them. A towering boiler beside a wooden settlement, a precision machine turbine in a region without documented machine shops. These may simply be artifacts transported from elsewhere. But when studied carefully, the logistical challenge becomes evident. Moving such equipment across thousands of kilometers in harsh climate conditions would have required a level of organization that contemporary records do not describe. Even the architecture surrounding early industrial zones seems to whisper a hidden story. Some factories contain design elements reminiscent of older, now vanished structures, arched foundations, geometrically aligned facades, intricate ventilation ducts. Were these merely stylistic choices, or were engineers building atop remnants of earlier designs they did not fully understand but found practical? None of this proves that Tartaria possessed advanced technology. That idea belongs to sensationalism. But what it does suggest is a more nuanced possibility, that elements of Eurasian technological heritage did not vanish. They were absorbed, repurposed, reattributed. The sudden industrial flowering may reflect not a miraculous burst of innovation, but the final resurfacing of older techniques long hidden beneath political reclassification, environmental upheaval, and the quiet fading of cultures whose craftsmanship was never archived. History teaches that knowledge does not move forward smoothly. It loops, collapses, disperses, and resurfaces. What seems new is often older than we realize. If Tartaria represented a constellation of cultures, then perhaps its influence lingers not in monuments or chronicles, but in the gears of forgotten machines, the patterns of early factories, and the faint, inexplicable maturity of technologies that appeared before the world was ready to explain them. And somewhere in that mechanical haze lies a question that refuses to settle. How much of the modern world was built on foundations whose origins no one living can name? When you reach this point in the labyrinth, after walking through vanished maps, half-buried buildings, displaced peoples, interrupted technologies, and silenced archives, you begin to sense a theme forming beneath the surface. Not a conclusion, not an answer, but a pattern, subtle as a shadow on snow. Something, whether natural, political, or intentional, reshaped the historical memory of an entire region. A pressure that smoothed rough details, folded inconvenient complexities, redirected ancestral stories, and left behind an outline so faint that modern eyes almost fail to see it. And when you study the centuries that bridge the old world and the modern one, a question rises like a slow, inevitable tide. Was there a mechanism, deliberate or accidental, that reset the cultural memory of Eurasia? A mechanism does not require a single catastrophic moment. It can unfold quietly through many converging forces, each eroding memory from a different angle. Natural disasters weaken communities. Empires impose new administrative structures. Revolutions burn archives. Industrialization covers old foundations with new steel.
Climate anomalies scatter populations. Linguistic policies replace ancestral names. Each event is small enough to explain individually. Together, they form a silence. And silence, especially when spread across a continent, often signals transformation far greater than the sum of its causes.
To imagine such a reset, one must first understand how fragile historical continuity truly is. Most cultures transmit their identity not through monumental architecture or formal chronicles, but through daily practice, rituals, songs, stories, migrations, seasonal knowledge, craft traditions. These forms of memory live only as long as people continue to perform them. Interrupt the performance, and the knowledge dissolves within a generation. Harsh winter, a forced relocation, a political decree banning traditional customs. Each can sever a lineage that once stretched back centuries. Now imagine these pressures unfolding simultaneously across a region the size of a continent. During the 17th to 19th centuries, Eurasia experienced volcanic winters, plagues, seismic upheavals, massive political realignments, religious reclassifications, imperial expansions, and modernization campaigns. At the same time, the world shifted from fluid cultural landscapes to rigid nation-states obsessed with borders, classifications, and administrative order. It was an era when complexity became inconvenient and simplification became policy. Entire cultural mosaics were compressed into ethnographic categories that fit the geopolitical vision of rising empires. In such an environment, any region whose identity did not align neatly with new political frameworks faced erasure, not through malice, but through absorption. The name Tartaria vanished from maps not because it was debunked, but because new powers needed clearer divisions. Tribes and clans were reorganized into administrative units. Local leaders were replaced with imperial officials. Traditions once expressed across wide territories were narrowed into smaller definitions. Even the language became a tool of consolidation, with dialects reclassified, standardized, or dismissed as rural variants. When labels change, memory changes. When memory changes, identity dissolves. Some researchers argue that this was not unique. Empires everywhere reshaped the past to solidify the present. The Romans erased the identities of conquered tribes. The Chinese reclassified border peoples under imperial categories. European colonial powers renamed entire continents. What makes the case of Tartaria unsettling is not the act of renaming, but the scale of the silence that followed. How does an entity that once appeared consistently on maps across multiple civilizations disappear so completely that its absence is treated as normal? How does a cultural zone stretching across half the world leave behind so few cohesive narratives? A reset does not require conspiracy. It requires a perfect storm. Political consolidation provided one force. As Russia expanded into Siberia and Central Asia, it implemented administrative reforms that replaced all the cultural maps with imperial geography. Local histories that did not align with the state's narrative were deprioritized, stored away, or lost amid bureaucratic chaos. Some were destroyed outright during wars, fires, or ideological purges. Others were simply neglected until decay consumed them. Economic change provided another force. Industrialization transformed landscapes rapidly, covering all the settlements, destroying archaeological layers, relocating populations, and reorienting trade routes. When trade shifts, cultures follow. And when cultures move, they lose the anchors that once held their stories in place. In this way, industrial progress, celebrated for its innovation, functioned as a subtle eraser. Environmental upheaval provided a third force. Climate instability forced nomadic cultures to alter migration patterns. Rivers changed course. Croplands vanished under frost or flood. Communities merged, fragmented, or disappeared entirely. Oral histories that once flowed smoothly became tangled or forgotten. And over all these forces hovered the ideological transformations of the modern era. The shift towards scientific geography, national identity, ethnic classification, and global politics required a more orderly world. Concepts too vast, too amorphous, or too regionally complex were replaced by precise boundaries. Tartaria, sprawling and multifaceted, had no place in the rigid cartographic logic of nation-states. So it vanished, not because it was false, but because it was unwieldy. At times, it is tempting to imagine a hidden hand guiding this reset. But it is equally possible that history itself, messy, fragile, and easily redirected, simply bent under the weight of overlapping transformations. In this view, Tartaria did not vanish through suppression. It dissolved through transition. Its peoples were absorbed into new identities. Its languages faded. Its architectures were repurposed. Its memories fractured across borders and centuries. What remains today are remnants too faint for conventional history to reconstruct. But even if the reset was accidental, a question still lingers with quiet insistence. Why did the silence settle so evenly? Why do the archives suffer such consistent gaps across such a large region? Why do early industrial anomalies cluster in areas where earlier cultural complexity is the least documented? Why does the timeline feel smoothed, as though someone brushed the surface of history to remove irregularities? Perhaps the mechanism was less a machine and more a mood, a shift in human perception. The modern world sought clarity, order, and progress. Anything that contradicted this vision was edited out, not through active suppression but through collective disinterest. Cultures that did not fit the emerging narrative of civilization were recast as primitive, transitional, or undefined. Their stories became irrelevant, their names disappeared, their presence faded, and yet the land remembers. The steppe carries the outlines of old migrations. The mountains hide fortresses without names. The rivers trace routes used long before imperial maps existed. The soil preserves tools crafted by hands that no longer have descendants who remember their purpose. Even the technologies of the industrial age carry whispers of forgotten traditions, patterns, signatures, methods that feel inherited rather than invented. If there was a reset, it was not a single moment, but a prolonged turning of the world, one that folded the past into forms that suited the rising powers. A reset not of machines, but of memory, not of people, but of identity. A reset executed not by malice, but by momentum, and somewhere inside that momentum lies the quiet, unsettling possibility that the world we inherited is not merely built on the ruins of earlier civilizations, but on the ruins of earlier understandings. Understandings carefully rearranged so that we would forget what once connected the vastness of Eurasia into something the old maps tried, in their own imperfect way, to name. The mechanism remains unseen, but its imprint is everywhere. At the end of a long journey, when you've walked through the blurred maps, the architectural ghosts, the fractured languages, the scattered machines, and the aching silence of lost archives, you arrive at a place that feels less like a conclusion and more like a threshold, a place where the world of evidence thins and something quieter begins to speak, not through documents or ruins, but through an impression, a lingering feeling that the past is not a straight line, but a tapestry with entire sections carefully rewoven. And in that dim light, the name that once stretched across half a continent begins to take on a new shape. Not as an empire, not as a myth, not as a secret kingdom buried beneath centuries, but as a symbol of how easily the truth of a civilization can be scattered across time until no single thread can be recognized. Perhaps that is why Tartaria lingers so persistently in the collective imagination, not because we can prove what it was, but because its absence feels deliberate, because its edges resemble the edges of other vanished worlds, civilizations whose names once echoed across landscapes, only to be compressed into footnotes or misinterpretations. Because its silence feels too even, too consistent, too synchronized with the political and environmental transformations that reshaped Eurasia. And because, beneath all that, there is still that faint haunting question. What exactly did the old mapmakers see when they wrote that name? When you trace their ink across parchment, you see not an empire but an understanding, a recognition that the lands stretching from the Urals to the Pacific formed a cultural sphere older and more fluid than modern borders allow. Peoples moved, traded, fought, merged, diverged, and merged again. Knowledge flowed with them. Technologies, stories, rituals, and symbols crossed vast distances without leaving written trails. To the mapmakers of centuries past, this world felt coherent. They marked it with a single name, knowing it was imperfect, but hoping it captured at least the outline of something real. Modern history rejected that name, not because the world it described vanished, but because new systems could not accommodate it. Empires needed administrative clarity. Nation-states needed fixed identities. Scientists needed precise ethnographic categories. And so the older, broader understanding was dismantled into fragments. Each fragment was given a new name, a new story, a new place in the global order. What once appeared as a single silhouette on maps became a mosaic whose pieces no longer remembered they once belonged to the same pattern. But the land remembers. The rivers continue to wind along ancient trade routes. The mountains guard fortresses whose builders have no recorded descendants. The forests hide burial mounds aligned with constellations no longer part of a local mythology. The steppes hold traces of migrations that shaped half the world, though their stories are now attributed to other names. The soil whispers of cities built, abandoned, rebuilt, and forgotten before the archives could bind them into history. This landscape, this vastness, this echo of something larger. Perhaps this is what the old maps try to gesture toward. And if you allow yourself to stand very still, you can sense the deeper truth that has been forming, softly and patiently, across this entire narrative, that Tartaria may not have been a single civilization lost to catastrophe or conspiracy, but a cultural horizon, a way of seeing the world through connections rather than borders, a recognition of continuity across peoples whose identities have since been separated by language, empire, and time. What vanished was not a kingdom, but an understanding erased by the combined weight of natural disaster, political ambition, archival vulnerability, and the relentless machinery of modernity. Yet even as this understanding dissolves into the present, its outline remains just visible enough to provoke unease. Not because history failed, but because it succeeded too well, streamlining the past into shapes that fit the needs of the moment. And needing clarity, it smoothed away everything that resisted categorization. Tartaria, sprawling and multifaceted, did not survive this smoothing. It dissolved into the margins, it slipped between classifications, it scattered into the identities of those who lived after, leaving behind only the faintest silhouette. In the end, the question is not whether Tartaria was real, but what its disappearance reveals about the nature of history itself. How much of what we believe is shaped by what survives, by what institutions choose to preserve, by which narratives gain authority? How much is determined by fire, accident, flood, or bureaucratic indifference? How much depends on the quiet choices of those who draw maps, transcribe documents, and decide which names deserve to endure? Perhaps the memory of Tartaria persists because it exposes a deeper, more uncomfortable truth, that entire worlds can be reshaped without leaving obvious scars, that continuity can be severed without catastrophe, that silence, when stretched across enough centuries, can mimic the effect of deliberate erasure, and that even now, with all our archives, satellites, and algorithms, there remain vast regions of human memory that lie just beyond the reach of certainty. So what remains at the end of this long path? Not an answer, not a revelation, but a feeling, soft, persistent, and strangely familiar. The sense that beneath the modern world lies another layer, faint but undeniable, composed of stories that were never allowed to fully gather into history. A layer woven from the lives of peoples who were absorbed into larger identities, whose technologies were reattributed, whose cities were rebuilt or forgotten, whose names were filed under labels they did not choose. a layer that map makers once tried to capture with a single, imperfect word, a word that now feels like an echo from another age. And as you step back from this journey, you realize that the true mystery is not why Tartaria vanished, but how much else may have vanished with it, how many cultural horizons dissolved before anyone thought to write them down, how many worlds flickered out before the archival net could catch them, how many names were smoothed away by the same pressures that reshaped this one. In the fading half-light of that realization, the question that has followed us from the beginning returns once more, quietly, gently, like a shadow brushing the edge of memory. If a whole world can disappear without leaving a clear trace, then what else lies just beneath the surface of the story we think we know?